Thank you. Okay. So we were learning this, we had just started this tshuva yesterday. A man says, I had a bunch of guests that I invited over for Shabbos. My neighbor was out of town. He offered to let them stay in his apartment. And then while they're there, they used some of the furniture, like the candlesticks. And then over Shabbos, the candlesticks got stolen. So who's liable? So, his first initial reaction is that the host, the person who invited his guests, and is the guy who's borrowing the apartment. So therefore, he should be the one who's liable for Geneva. However, we do have a case of Shomer Shemasar L'Shomer, that if one guard of an object gives it over to another person to watch over, as long as we can ascertain that the owner would have given it over to the second guy. In other words, he has no problem with the second guy. So then the second guy is going to be liable and not the first. But then on the other hand, he wants to put forward that maybe the guests are going to be liable for the candlesticks. And he says, because when a woman, he brings a case from the Gemara that if a woman borrows an object when she's single, let's say she's still holding on to it, and like a can opener, and then while she's got the can opener in her possession, she gets married. The husband has even though the husband is using her stuff and really takes control over all of her assets in the household, nonetheless, she's going to she's the one who's liable. Afilu shehu hishtamish ba kol yemei sheilasa. He's going to be pater, and she would have to pay if damage occurs or loss occurs to the can opener. However, if she notifies her husband that she's borrowed the can opener or the animal or whatever she's borrowed, then the husband does assume all liability. So therefore, even though she's benefiting from her husband's use of the utensil, nonetheless, once the husband knows that it's a borrowed item, he becomes the liable party. So perhaps you could make the argument that because the guests know that it's a borrowed apartment, they assume liability. Okay, so that was on the other hand. And so therefore, he paskins that al pi halacha, it would seem that the guests should be liable. Nira shehaorchim chayavim b'gnevas hapetumim v'chayavim l'shalom balabayas aleihim. It would seem that the guests who are staying in the apartment should have to pay the balabayas for the stolen candlesticks. The afal pi shehem lo shalu es hadira v'achafetzim sheba yeshiros balabayas, even though they didn't borrow the apartment directly from the homeowner, they may have never even met the homeowner, never have communicated with the homeowner. But since they know that they're in a borrowed apartment, they are going to be liable for anything that they know is borrowed on their behalf and that they're benefiting from, just like a husband who knows that he's using his wife's property and that one item of that property is borrowed. He's going to be liable for that borrowed item, as is paskined in the Shulchan Aruch. And then he concludes by saying, but if the homeowner has no interaction whatsoever, and these guests maybe are from out of town, and he doesn't want to be bothered by having to send communication to these guests who he's never met, he has a right to tell his neighbor who he lent the apartment to, I'm holding you responsible, and have the neighbor collect the money from the guests. Kevin shehuzeh shesholas hadir v'nene ba'al yedei sheshichin shames orchav ve'al kain gam hu nechshav l'shal, because he too is considered to be a borrower since he benefited from that transaction, from the giving over the apartment. Amnam ba'ofen shahama areach omer la'orchav yesh li shachen shemuchan lahashil lachem es hadira shalo nira shehachrayas hi rak al ha'orchim. If, however, the host, the guy who's borrowing the apartment for his guests, says to his guests, I have a neighbor who would be prepared to lend you his apartment. Would you like to take him up on that opportunity? Then he's implicitly recusing himself from liability. In other words, it all depends on how he presents the prospect to his guests. If he says to his guests, you'll be my guests, I've made arrangements for you to stay at my friend's house, everything's all set. So then if damage or loss occurs to the friend's house while the guests are there, then the homeowner can go directly to his neighbor to collect, because he's assuming the role of the balabais, right? If, however, he presents it to his guests as, you can either stay in my 3-year-old's bedroom, all 5 of you, or my neighbor did offer that you could stay at his apartment or at his home. It's up to you. What would you prefer? And if by presenting it that way, he's basically saying, I'm not assuming liability. That's almost implicit in what he's saying.
Like he's pulling himself out of that arrangement.
Right. And I would go even further. He should probably say, I don't know if you have small kids, I don't know what he's got hanging out. He may have some glass artwork on the coffee table. You may just want to check it out first. And if it doesn't work for you, you can stay in my 3-year-old's bedroom, all 5 of you, and you'll be fine. We'll put out some sleeping bags on the floor.
There's no obligation to have this guest go back to the owner of the house and say, we're going to be staying here. The original owner doesn't need to.
No, the original owner has to know that the keys of his apartment that he gave to his neighbor, he told his neighbor, if you have your friends here and they want to stay at our apartment, they're welcome to.
I missed
that. That's already been communicated. Obviously, if the neighbor, the owner of the home, doesn't know that people are going to come into his house, you're not allowed to do that. That would be an act of geneva, right? Okay. So that's what we saw yesterday, and I really just want to go through some of the footnotes because we had some interesting questions. Part of the shaila was the neighbor lit the candlesticks for Shabbos, and is that an integral part of the shaila? What if the candlesticks were just on the mantelpiece and the guest didn't use the candlesticks at all? Does that change? Will that change the circumstance? Okay.
I'm sure have your friend sign a waiver for them to stay at someone's house.
Well, you want to know something? It does happen. It does happen that damage can happen. I was petrified. My kids stayed at someone's apartment in the conservatory with their 3-year-old and their 1-year-old. And my wife and I went over there beforehand to drop off put some food in the refrigerator because they were away. And we saw all this fragile stuff on the coffee table.
Intact. Yes.
Yeah. And we were a little bit worried. And we said to our kids, listen, I don't know how you want to do this, but you're going to have to childproof the house before you even come in. Because this house is owned by seniors and they're not prepared to, anyway. All right. So anyway.
Yeah, unless they have grandchildren of their own, that usually.
Yeah. Right. Okay. So we learned about Shomer Shemosar L'Shomer. That's the first footnote, is that the first one is going to be Potter, sub Bailey, as Marv used the term. He says, Af dekan Iri B'dinei She'ela, even though they're not exactly analogous, Shomer Shemosar L'Shomer, to the Arshit situation, because we're talking about borrowing here. We're not talking about watching something. Kvar Kosov Hashach Degam B'Shol Amrinan Shem Hamashal Rogel Lahashal L'Shoyel Hasheni Potter Kishi Yishba Hasheni. He says that with a shoal as well, we say that if the lender would have normally lent the item either to the first guy or the second guy, then the first guy is going to be putter from all liability if the second guy takes a vow. Takes a vow, I guess he would have to take a vow that the mashil, the owner of the item, used to lend it to me as well. The cost of b'shulchan aruch harav shebechi gavna mutar lahashel l'sheni afilu lechatchila. And the Shulchan Aruch Harav says that if I have borrowed something from my friend, and I know that my friend has a pattern of lending that same item to Yankel, I'm allowed to lend it directly to Yankel because I already know that there's a pattern here. And so certainly over here, where the first Shoel had asked permission, in other words, the guy who's hosting his friends for Shabbos explicitly said, "Can I borrow your apartment for my guests?" So here it's clear that the second party, the actual user of the apartment, assumes liability. The next thing we wanted to see is the guests are so the first argument that he wanted to make is right. So on the one hand, he wanted to argue that the host, the guy who's hosting them, should be liable because he's the one who asked the favor. And he said it's not analogous to Shomer Shemasar L'Shomer because once I give it over to the second party assumes all liability and I've recused myself. Whereas over here, I'm benefiting from the fact that my guests have a place to stay for Shabbos. Okay, so the argument that he initially wanted to make was that the host assumes liability because he's benefiting from his guests using the apartment. But then he swings to the other side and he says, but the guest should be liable. And he says, "V'hinei yesh la'ayin daharei pasak maran b'shulchan aruch dashoyel lo mitchayev b'li kinyan v'al kein gam kan tzarich sha'orchim yasu kinyan ala petumim kidei lihitchayev be'achrayas aleihem." He says, wouldn't they have to make a kinyan and in some way lift up the candlesticks in order to assume liability as a shoel? Ubishlama im iri shalakchu es apetumim kidei lahadlik bahem asu kinyan bahag bahasam. If they in any way handled the candlesticks, you might be able to argue that that's a kinyan. However, amnam yesh ladun ba'ofen shaptumim kvar hayu b'makom ha'adlaka v'ha'archim lo nagu bahem v'rak idliku bahem v'achar kach nignavu. But what if the candlesticks are in their place, the guests never touched them, and all they did was the candles were already in the holders, and all they did was light the candles, and then they got stolen? They didn't really handle the candlesticks at all. And would you therefore say that they became a shoel nonetheless? Normally, a shoel's liability starts when he does some act of acquisition of the item. Have they really acquired the item?
Or they're using it, that's not considered any form of it.
So that's the question. Is the use of it tantamount to becoming a shoel? Hine ayin b'nesivas shehochiach she'afal pi sheshol lo asa kinyan b'chayfetz hashol im hishtamesh bo hashimush bo havikikinyan lihitchayev be'achrayus ayin sham. So exactly what Moshe was suggesting is what the Nesiva says. Just the use of it even without physically handling it, makes you a shoel. ולפי זה יש לומר גם הכה, דאף אם לא עשו קינן בפטומים מכל מקום השימוש בהם, it's a typo, הבי כקניין. Then omnam ayin b'sefer erech shai shecholak al divrei hanasi v'susvirle d'chol zman shasholo asa kinen meshicha b'chayfetz harei pater. But there's a sefer erech shai who disagrees with the nesivas, and he says if they didn't pick up the candlesticks or do something to them to show that they want to borrow them, they will be blameless. V'rak chayev kisha asa kinyan kiroi kedini mekachu memkar. And he brings proof from Rishonim. However, there's another reason to make the guests liable, because they're acquiring the apartment and its entire contents. Because there's something called the kinyan agav. When I acquire a piece of real estate, I also incidentally acquire everything that's resting on the real estate. The Kemosha b'mekachu memkar misha sakinin al karka konagamis kolametaltalim shabo. That if when I acquire real estate, I acquire all the chattel that's resting upon it. Kemosha nifsak b'shulchan aruch hachanami kisharchim kiblu es hadira v'asu kinyan ba. So they got the keys to the apartment. They walk across the front door. So havi ki'ilu asu kinyan al hachafetzim shebebayis midin agav. Then they automatically become, they've automatically sort of acquired, shall we say, temporarily, all of the contents of the apartment. Balkein yuchayavim ala petumim, and they'll be therefore liable for the candlesticks. And it would seem even if they don't end up using the candlesticks, right, just by virtue of the fact that they're He says, "Amnom gam bazeh yesh lodin l'fi masher kasav haktzais hachoshen shehikshal masher pasuk morin b'shulchan aruch hamosu lechaveru lishmor davar hamachuber lekarka dino kekarka filu anavim haomnim libatzer ad kan l'shona." But he says, but let's quote a statement from the Ketzos HaChoshen. The Shulchan Aruch paskins if an owner of a vineyard asks his friend to watch over his vineyard, then everything that's attached to the ground has the status of the real estate itself, even if the grapes that are growing on the vine are fully ripe and ready to be harvested. V'harei anovim ha'omdim libatzer dinam kimetaltalin k'deisa b'shulchan aruch v'imkein amai lo yischayev b'shmirasim midin agav. He says the grapes have the status of metaltalin. Why wouldn't a person dino kekarka filu anovim ha'omdim libatzer? He says, why does it have to, I think what he's asking is, why does it have to be attached to the ground? By virtue of the fact that it's chattel that's resting on the ground would be enough of a reason to be liable. The tirei tzaktzos hachoshen shekivin shal hakarka eino ein dine shmira v'lochein hakinin she'asu bekarka lo mahani li'itchayev ba'achrayusa al kein hakinin agav al ha'metaltalin u'mechayva gam kein bedine shmira ayin sham. So I think there must be a typo here because he says the Ketzos says that if the contract made with the shomer was specifically for watching the real estate, we're going to have to take a look at this halacha. He says, "Gam benidon didan kevin sha'al hadira ein chiyuve achrayas kevin she'ein chiyuve shmira bekarka memela eno mischayv al metaltalin shabbat sheniknu ba'agav." So then the question is a person ever liable for protecting real estate, or can you only be held liable for protecting chattel? And if the only way that you acquired the chattel was via the real estate, then if you can't be held liable for the real estate, you can't be held liable for the chattel either. But so let's take a look. Choshen Mishpat Tzadi Hey Sif Beis. Let's just take a quick look at that halacha. Okay. Tanu anovim ha'omdim libotzer tfu yevesh omedes likotzer. If the owner of the property made a claim against the shomer that my grapes were stolen or my wheat was stolen, and it's already ripened. V'hoda b'mikzasan v'kofar b'mikzasan, areze nishba aleim kishar hametaltalim. Then the shomer, if he admits to being negligent in some but not in others, then it's a moda b'mikzas. He's a partial admission, and there are various that take a shvua, just because we treat this as chattel. Like Demari Shetavo Hamaos Shel Anavim Aval Itavo Anavim V'Hoda B'Mikzasan. Okay. Okay, this is I don't know why he's referred us to Sif Bays. But basically, here, let me just go back here for 1 second. Yichasa. Okay, Simin Shin Aleph Sifei. Let's take a look at Shin Aleph Sifei. Don't know why this is not coming up on the screen. Let's see here. Okay, Hamosu lechaver lishmar davar hamachuber lekarka dino kikarka afilu anovim haomdim libatzer. That if you give over to your friend to watch over something that's attached to the ground, it has the same status as the ground, even if they're grapes that are waiting to be harvested. Now, what does this say? So, and therefore, let's see, what is, let's see. Okay, so they have the status of karka. He says, "Harei anothim omdim libotz or dinim kimetaltlim." Oh, okay. So the question is like this. Normally, you're not liable for damage to real estate if it's mamish real estate. And we've seen this actually before, that house damage, can you be held liable for damage to a house, to the walls of a house, let's say, for example. Why should you be liable? V'tirei tzaktzos shekevin shalakarka eno din shmira, v'lachein hakinyan sha'asu bekarka lo mahani litchayiv ba'achriyusa, al kinyan agav al hamataltel lo mechayiv gam kain b'dinei shmira. Since you held yourself as a shomer for the real estate, and the real estate you're not a shomer for, so anything that was attached to the ground, you're not going to be liable for either, because you only became connected to it through the real estate. The contract was on the real estate. Well, and therefore you could argue that since I'm not liable for protecting real estate, I'm only liable for protecting chattel. Therefore, I shouldn't be held liable for things that I only acquired via a kinyan agav through the real estate. Al kain hayanira lichora the b'chiyai gavner she'orchem lo higbiu es apetumim elad liku b'hem b'makomam, and therefore it would seem that if the guests only lit the candlesticks but never moved them, never picked them up, אפשר יהיה לחייבם באחרייס הפטומים כיוון שיוכלו לטעון כמלי כערך שי ששימוש בחפץ לא הביא כקניין להסחייב באחרייס החפץ השול. They could say, well, we never made a kinyan on the candlesticks. וגם יכולנו לטעון כמלון כהקצוס, דגם kinyan אגב לא יכול לחייבם באחרייס בחי. They could also say, and we only acquired the contents of the apartment via the real estate of the apartment. And since we never really, you never really become a shomer on real estate, we can't become liable for that. However, Amnam Shuv He'iranu Yedid Nafshi Harav Hagon Ariel Lahav Shlita, he says, but my friend Ariel Lahav showed me the Yesh Lomer Deharchim Kanu Esaptuma Midin Kinyan Chatzer, that they acquired it from another kinyan. There's a kinyan chatzer means that you acquire something by acquiring the real estate. It's slightly different than kinyan agav. Kinyan agav and kinyan chatzer are two separate types of kinyanim. They're very similar. Kinyan agav is where you simultaneously acquire one through the other, and kinyan chatzer is sequential. Like if I acquire this table, then I can later acquire the mouse that's on the table through the fact that the table is mine. And the Rambam seems to support that. That the halacha is, says the Rambam, that if a woman owns a piece of real estate and you want to divorce her, by throwing the get onto the property, she acquires the get and is thereby divorced. Now, that's true even if she was only borrowing the property. So you can throw the get in her borrowed.
It's hers at the time.
Yeah, because it's hers at the time. So you see, v'chein pasuk morin b'shulchan aruch nimtz diyesh kinyan chatzer b'chatzer she'ula. So therefore, when even by borrowing an apartment, you become the owner of that temporarily, of that real estate, and you acquire all of the contents of that real estate. V'isa lahedja b'bava metzia demahani la'asos kinyan chatzer li'schai b'dinei shoel k'mo she'amra hagemara dekei kegon dekaima para b'chatzera deshoel delo mechsera mashicha ayin sham. Another example, he says, is the Gemara in Bava Metzia says that if I borrow a field and I want to make use of the cow, I can say that the real estate that I've borrowed also gives me rights to borrow the cow through acquiring the cow on the borrowed property. V'imkein hachanami yesh lamer she'ha'orchim asu kinyan ala petumim al yidei kinyan chatzer v'yafal pi shemashmi morin b'shulchan aruch shlam rinin kinyan chatzer l'socher b'chatzer muskeres lo mikol makom kvar chilek shamashach de'echad adas acheres makna shaper dami v'hachanami haisa kavanas baladir la'ashelem asadir v'chatfeitzim shaba v'lachen yesh lamer demani kinyan chatzer b'chei gavin l'izchai b'petumim b'dog. He says it was certainly the intent of the homeowner who's lending out his apartment to give access to the guests to use all of the appliances and all of the amenities that are contained within the apartment. And so therefore, he can give over, just like he gives over the apartment to the guests, he's also giving over all of the contents for their use, and therefore they become the liable party. So that's the consensus, and it would turn out, therefore, that even if they never lit or made use of the candlesticks, but are aware that the apartment has expensive things in it, they become liable. If, however, let's say there's something in the apartment, let's say there's a safe behind a painting, that they never knew about and that they weren't expected to know about, and that the homeowner would not want the guests to have access to. And then thieves come in the middle of the night, and they break in and they discover the safe, or maybe they knew about the safe because the housekeeper found it one day and she told her husband or whatever. And then they break in and they crack the safe and they pull out all, $500,000 worth of diamonds and stuff like that. So, like a heist, right? So then for sure the guests would not be liable in that situation because there was no way for them to know. And that was never part of the deal that was being, given. That was not, when they got the apartment, it wasn't the homeowner's intentions that they should have access to that amenity.
Sounds like an insurance joke.
What?
Italian job.
Sounds like an insurance joke to me.
Yeah. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this. I do have the next packet, and I will send it out to you right away. And so so we'll start the next Shuva, Amir Hashem, tomorrow. Okay.